to remind the world that the actions for which he was indicted and for which he has now pled guilty are actions that put the lives of our partners, our allies, and our diplomats at risk, especially those who work in dangerous places like Afghanistan and Iraq.
Sorry, so I actually did cover the State Department back then, and I don't remember there being any public, there was a public concern that was raised about the potential security risk posed to...
I'm sorry to be a few minutes late. Just start with a couple things. Earlier today, Evan Gershkovich appeared in a courtroom in Yekaterinburg, Russia. We have been clear from the start that journalism is not a crime and that Evan should never have been detained in the first place. What happened today was a performance put on by Russian authorities to justify their repression of journalists and independent voices. Embassy Moscow officials were granted brief access to the courtroom before proceedings began. However, they were not permitted to speak to Evan. Russia should stop using individuals like Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan as bargaining chips. They should both be released immediately, and I can attest to both Evan and Paul and their families that the United States will not rest until we have brought both of them home.
Given officials in the Biden administration have said, once a trial begins, it's not highly likely that there will be a deal to secure that person's release. Now that we're seeing this trial begin, what do you guys expect in terms of the likelihood of any deal coming to fruition in the near term here?
I don't want to make any kind of public assessment or speak to negotiations that happen, of course, in private. We have been working to bring both Evan and Paul home since they were detained. And as we've said, we have put a significant offer on the table some months ago. We continue to work privately to try to secure their release. We shouldn't have to do that. They should both be released immediately, but we will continue our efforts. Those have been happening before Evan's trial. They will continue during the trial, and should he be convicted, which of course he will be, it's not a free trial, they will continue after the trial, but we want to see him returned home immediately.
And that significant offer that you guys have repeatedly referred to that was put on the table months ago, has that offer been re-upped in any way or changed and put back on the table in any way? Or are we still standing at that singular offer that you guys keep pointing back to?
I just don't want to speak to this in public. I don't want to negotiate in public. I've seen that Russian officials have made comments about this matter in recent days, and I don't want to respond to those either. We are working day and night to try to secure the release of both Evan and Paul, and that will continue.
Just follow up.
Yeah.
Absolutely correctly, the embassy officials were ushered out prior to the...
They were there before the start of the hearing, and they were not allowed to attend the hearing itself.
Thank you. What can you tell us about his condition? We also saw his pictures from this glass, behind the glass cage. Where is he being held right now during the trial?
I can follow up with you that off. I don't have it here at the podium. I can follow up with this where he's being held off.
Did embassy officials have a chance to interact with him?
They did not. I said that in my opening statements.
And I know you guys don't typically get into politics from this podium, but given that it directly intersects with your efforts to secure Evan, the former president, Trump, who's now the Republican nominee, said earlier that Evan would be released prior to him taking office if he wins the election on November 5th. Is there any legitimacy to that claim as far as this building knows?
So I am not going to deal with comments made in a political context in a political campaign, but I would note that I would hope that every American who cares about the safety and security of their fellow American citizens would demand the release of Evan and Paul now. Not November, not December, not January, but now. That ought to be the position of every American, because I would hope that every American citizen wants to see these two wrongfully detained Americans return home immediately. So, yeah.
Moving on to Julian Assange, now that he's free and in Australia, are you satisfied with the outcome of this? And can you give us any details on the diplomatic negotiations that went ongoing between Australia, the US, UK, and all that? Give
Yeah.
us any light on that.
So with respect to the first question, I'm not going to have any comment, only because under our system we have an independent Justice Department that makes its own decisions on these matters, and it's appropriate that they be the ones that speak to them and not have other departments in the United States weigh in one way or the other. That has always been the case, but of course we have confidence in our colleagues at the Justice Department to make these decisions and make them in with the full interest of the United States in mind. As it pertains to involvement of the State Department, I can tell you it was very limited. Only in the last few days, this was a matter that was handled by the Justice Department through law enforcement channels. There was some small coordination role between our embassy and the Australian government just in the past few days, but this was, other than that, a law enforcement matter handled through law enforcement channels.
But are you satisfied that the case is over?
So look, the Justice Department has spoken to that, and I don't have anything to add.
But
Obviously, the ambassador put out a statement that said we were happy to work with our Australian colleagues on it, and that remains the case. I do think it is important when we talk about Julian Assange to remind the world that the actions for which he was indicted and for which he has now pled guilty are actions that put the lives of our partners, our allies, and our diplomats at risk, especially those who work in dangerous places like Afghanistan and Iraq. This was some years ago now, almost 15 years ago, so I think the world has forgotten much of it. But if you recall, when WikiLeaks first disseminated and published State Department documents, State Department cables, they did so without redacting names. They just threw them out there for the world to see. And so the documents they published gave identifying information of individuals who were in contact with the State Department. That included opposition leaders, human rights activists around the world, whose positions were put in some danger because of their public disclosure. It also chilled the ability of American personnel to build relationships and have frank conversations with them. And at the time, those of you who covered the State Department at the time will probably remember that in the days leading up to that release, the State Department really had to scramble to get people out of danger, to move them out of harm's way. It was an extraordinary effort performed by dozens of government officials around the world, but that doesn't change the danger that those actions put innocent people all around the world in through no fault of their own. And that's, of course, not even to mention the further actions by WikiLeaks down the road to essentially serve as a conduit for Russian intelligence interfering in the U.S. presidential election.
Sorry, so I actually did cover the State Department back then, and I don't remember there being any public, there was a public concern that was raised about the potential security risk posed to sources who might have been quoted. Was there actually any, did you ever discover anyone who was injured, killed, had to go into hiding because of them?
So a few things about that. One, I can't give you a definitive answer only because I wasn't here at the time and so much time. And
okay,
so hold on. Let me finish. I have a full answer on it.
Okay.
One, I can't speak to that because it was some years ago, and I don't have a full accounting of what happened. But number two, the State Department did an extraordinary amount of work when we found out that these cables were going to be published to get people out of harm's way, to go around and look at what might become public and take action so people that would be put in danger would be put out of harm's way. But third, if you drive drunk down the street and get pulled over for drunk driving, the fact that you didn't crash into another car and kill someone doesn't get you out of the reckless actions and the endangerment that you put your fellow citizens in. And it's the same thing. The same principle applies here.
Right. Well, I don't think that it does. But the fact of the matter is that the State Department has been, at least as far as I know, and maybe I'm wrong, but has never been able to point to anyone who was compromised or killed or put at risk because of this.
Their identities were compromised. The State Department went to great work to get people out of harm's way, to prevent that very action from happening.
Do you know how many people about?
As I said, this was some time ago. I was in the government at the time, not at the State Department. I'd have to go back and look at it, but I do know that there was work around the world, especially in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places around the world where they did have to do a great amount of work to kind of move people out of harm's way.
One of your predecessors, P.J. Crowley, who was standing at the podium at the time, went to great pains to talk about the potential damage that could or would be caused by these revelations. And unless I missed it, I didn't hear that there was any
as I said, number one, the department went to a great amount of effort to avoid people being put in harm's way, but it doesn't absolve anyone of their responsibility. I know, but I know you're not, but it's an important point. Just because people were able to mitigate the harm done by your actions, that doesn't absolve you of your actions in the first place.
Okay.